The cold, gray walls of the courtroom felt like they were closing in. The weight of injustice pressed down on every breath he took. Daniel Reeves sat motionless in his chair, his hands clenched into fists beneath the table. His public defender had stopped talking. The judge had stopped listening. And the jury? Their verdict had been read in chilling finality just moments ago. Guilty. A murmur had rippled through the crowd as gasps and whispers filled the air. The evidence had been circumstantial at best, yet the prosecution had painted Daniel as a monster, a cold-blooded murderer, a man deserving of life behind bars. His stomach churned as the words echoed in his head. We, the jury, find the defendant, Daniel Reeves, guilty of murder in the first degree. The judge's voice cut through his haze. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel came down like the final nail in his coffin. Gasps erupted from the small group of supporters behind him. His sister, Emily, let out a choked sob. His closest friends stared in stunned silence. But there was one absence that burned more than anything. Max, his dog, his best friend. Max had been home the night of the murder. A loyal, sharp-eyed German shepherd who had never let anything slip past him. If only Max could talk. If only someone had listened when Daniel tried to explain that his dog had reacted to someone else in the house that night. But no one had cared. The system had chewed him up, spit him out. And now? Now he was nothing more than another number in the prison system. The bailiffs moved in. Cold metal clicked around his wrists as they cuffed him. He barely felt it. His body was there, but his mind was already drifting away. Away to the one creature in the world who had never doubted him. Max. He had one last request before they took him away, forever. His voice was hoarse, thick with emotions he barely contained. Please, he murmured, just let me see my dog. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. And what happened next left everyone in shock. Daniel's request had hung in the air, an unexpected plea that momentarily silenced the chaos of the courtroom. Even the judge, a stern man with decades of experience, hesitated. A prisoner begging to see his dog before being locked away for life? It was unheard of. The bailiffs exchanged glances, unsure what to do. His lawyer looked stunned, as if Daniel had just signed his own death warrant. But Daniel didn't care about the whispers, the judgment, or the glares. Max was the only thing that mattered. Finally, after a tense moment, the judge sighed and rubbed his temples. This is highly irregular, he muttered, then turned to Daniel's lawyer. How long would it take to bring the dog here? Emily, Daniel's sister, immediately stepped forward, her eyes red and swollen from crying. He's right outside. I brought him today, just in case. Her voice wavered. Please, Your Honor. The judge exhaled. Fine. 5 minutes. Then we proceed with transport. The tension in Daniel's chest eased, only slightly. 5 minutes. That was all he had. 2 guards stood on either side of him as the heavy courtroom doors creaked open. The air shifted. There was a beat of silence. Then, the scrambling of claws on the marble floor. Daniel barely had time to react before a blur of fur came charging toward him. Max! The German shepherd let out a strangled whimper, a half-bark, half-cry of desperation as he leaped toward Daniel, only to be caught at the last second by a guard grabbing his harness. Easy, the guard snapped, struggling to hold back the 90-pound dog. But Max wasn't easy. He twisted, growled, fought. His deep brown eyes locked onto Daniel's, filled with something raw, something Daniel had never seen before. Panic. Not for himself. For Daniel. Let him come to me, Daniel pleaded. His voice cracked, but he didn't care. The bailiff hesitated, glancing at the judge. The judge nodded. The second Max was released, he lunged, not in attack, not in aggression, but in frantic desperation. His massive paws slammed against Daniel's chest as he shoved his face into his owner's neck, whining so loudly it was almost a scream. Daniel closed his eyes. He buried his face into Max's fur, inhaling the familiar scent of home. But then something changed. Max suddenly went rigid. His tail dropped. His ears shot up. His entire body froze against Daniel's. Daniel felt the shift instantly. Max wasn't just happy to see him. He was on high alert. The German shepherd's powerful nose twitched. His head jerked up, his ears swiveling. He let out a sharp huff, then another. He was smelling something. Someone. Daniel followed his gaze, and his blood ran cold. Max was staring straight at the prosecution's lead witness, Elliot Grayson, the man who had testified that he saw Daniel leaving the crime scene, the man whose words had sealed Daniel's fate, the man who had looked him in the eye as he lied under oath. And now, Max was growling, a deep, guttural sound that Daniel had only heard once before. The night of the murder. His heart slammed against his ribs. "Max," he whispered. The dog's gaze never wavered. His body coiled like a loaded spring. His nostrils flared as he took in deep, aggressive sniffs. The courtroom had gone silent. Then, suddenly, Max lunged. The crowd gasped as the guards moved to restrain him, but Max wasn't attacking. He wasn't biting. He was pointing. His massive front paws slammed onto the wooden railing in front of Elliot Grayson, his body leaning forward as he let out a sharp, barking snarl. Daniel's breath hitched. Max wasn't acting randomly. He was identifying a target, just like he had been trained to do as a K9 search and rescue dog. Max had recognized something. A scent. A match. The pieces clicked in Daniel's mind. The night of the murder, Max had reacted the exact same way. He had growled, barked, and tried to track something in the house. Daniel had assumed it was a stray scent, a meaningless reaction. But now, Max knew. He knew the real killer. And he had just exposed him, right in front of the entire courtroom. Elliot Grayson's face drained of color. He swallowed hard, his fingers twitching. "See, control your dog," he stammered. Max's growl deepened. The judge slammed his gavel. "What is going on?" Emily, Daniel's sister, stepped forward breathless. "Your Honor, Max was at the house the night of the murder. If he's reacting now, that means—" She turned to Daniel, realization dawning in her eyes. Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. "It means he smelled the real killer that night." A hush fell over the room. The weight of those words crushed the air. Elliot took a shaky step back. This is ridiculous. It's a dog. Dogs make mistakes." Daniel's lawyer, who had been stunned into silence, suddenly sprang into action. "Your Honor, I request an immediate review of this witness's testimony, and I want DNA testing on any evidence collected at the crime scene." The prosecution objected. The defense fought back. Chaos erupted, but Daniel barely heard it, because Max was still staring down the man who had taken everything from him. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Daniel felt something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. The courtroom was chaos. Lawyers shouted over one another. The judge slammed his gavel for order, and gasps rippled through the crowd. But Daniel couldn't focus on any of it. His eyes were locked on Max. The German shepherd hadn't moved. His entire body remained tense, muscles coiled like a loaded spring. His dark eyes burned into Elliot Grayson, the prosecution's star witness, the man whose testimony had condemned Daniel to life in prison. Max had recognized something. A scent, a presence, a truth no one else could see. And Daniel knew with every fiber of his being, that his dog had just revealed the real killer. But how? Max had been at the house the night of the murder. He had reacted then, too, growling, pacing, barking at someone. But in the chaos of that night, Daniel had brushed it off, assuming Max was just unsettled by the crime scene. Now it was clear. Max hadn't been confused. He had known. And now, in front of a room full of people, he was telling the world what Daniel had failed to understand that night. It was him. Control that dog. Elliot Grayson's voice cracked as he stumbled backward, away from Max's snarling, pointed stance. His usual calm demeanor had shattered. His hands trembled. His face had lost all color. Emily, Daniel's sister, was the first to speak. "Your Honor," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "Please, you have to see what's happening. Max isn't just reacting. He's identifying." The judge hesitated. His face, usually unreadable, showed the first flickers of doubt. "This is a courtroom, not a police station," he said carefully. "Dogs cannot testify, but they can detect lies." The words came from Daniel's lawyer, Mr. Lawson. He had been silent until now, absorbing everything, but his sharp legal mind was now in overdrive. Your Honor, Lawson continued, stepping forward. Max is a trained search and rescue dog, one of the best. His nose can differentiate scents with near-perfect accuracy. If he's reacting to Mr. Grayson now, after being present at the crime scene, it means he recognizes something from that night. The judge frowned. You're asking me to reconsider a case based on a dog's reaction? Yes, Lawson said without hesitation. And I'm requesting an immediate stay of my client's sentencing so we can investigate further. The prosecutor, an older woman with graying hair, scoffed. This is absurd. We have witness testimony, forensic evidence, and a jury conviction. You want to throw all of that out because of a dog? Max let out another sharp bark, as if offended. Lawson remained steady. We have a dog who was there when the crime happened. A dog that is trained to detect human scents, who is now aggressively responding to the only witness whose testimony directly put my client behind bars. That is not a coincidence. The judge hesitated. His fingers tapped against the bench as he considered the arguments. Finally, he exhaled and looked at Elliot Grayson. Mr. Grayson, do you have an explanation for why this dog is reacting to you in this way? Elliot stammered, his hands clenching at his sides. I don't know. I've never even met this dog before today. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Liar. Max hadn't mistaken him. His dog was never wrong. Elliot turned to the judge, frantic now. This is insane. You're really going to entertain this nonsense? The judge studied him, and for the first time since the trial began, Daniel saw it, doubt. Then, the judge made his decision. I'm granting the defense's request. Daniel Reeves' sentencing will be stayed while we re-examine key evidence. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Emily gasped, covering her mouth. Lawson let out a breath of relief. The prosecution stiffened, clearly displeased. But Daniel only looked at Max. His faithful companion was still standing strong, his tail still, his eyes locked onto the man who had ruined Daniel's life. Max had done it. He had stopped the injustice before it was too late. But now came the hard part, proving it. Daniel sat in his holding cell that night, staring at the cracked ceiling. The cold metal cot beneath him barely registered. His mind was racing. Elliot Grayson. Why had Max reacted to him specifically? He needed answers, and there was only one place to start. The next morning, Lawson arrived, carrying a thick file in his hands. His expression was tight, focused. You're not going to believe this. Daniel sat up. Try me. Lawson laid the file down and flipped it open, revealing grainy photographs of Elliot Grayson. Turns out, our star witness has a history. Daniel's heart pounded. What kind of history? Lawson tapped the papers. He used to work for a security company, one that specialized in guard dogs. Daniel's blood ran cold. Max had been a former police dog before Daniel adopted him, a trained professional with years of service. And now, the man who had falsely testified against him just so happened to have a background in dogs. What are you saying? Daniel whispered. Lawson's expression darkened. I think Grayson knew your dog. I think he was at your house before the murder. And I think Max remembers him. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. It made sense. Max hadn't just reacted to Grayson in the courtroom. He had recognized him. But if that was true, then Grayson hadn't just lied on the stand. He had been involved in the murder itself. Lawson pushed another document toward Daniel. I pulled Grayson's financials. He received a large deposit in his account a week before the murder. And guess where it came from? Daniel clenched his jaw. Tell me. Lawson exhaled. The victim. A sick feeling settled in Daniel's stomach. The entire case had been built around motive. That he had supposedly killed the victim in a fit of rage over money. But if the victim had been paying Grayson before the murder, then everything changed. Grayson hadn't been a witness. He had been involved. And Max, his loyal, brilliant German shepherd, had been the only one who had seen the truth all along. Daniel's hands trembled as he reached for the papers. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Max had given him a second chance. And now, Daniel was going to prove his innocence. The cold walls of the prison visitation room seemed to close in around Daniel as he sat across from his attorney. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. The truth was so close. Max had exposed the cracks in the prosecution's case, and the financial records had driven the first real wedge of doubt into his conviction. But it wasn't enough. They needed hard proof. Lawson flipped open his briefcase and pulled out a new file. His expression was grave. "We found something." Daniel leaned forward. "What is it?" Lawson hesitated, then slid the file across the table. "Surveillance footage from a gas station near your house. The night of the murder." Daniel's hands trembled as he opened the folder. The grainy image on top sent a chill down his spine. It was Elliot Grayson, at a gas station 2 blocks from Daniel's house, at the exact time of the murder. Daniel's breath caught. He said he was at home that night. Lawson nodded grimly. "He lied." Daniel clenched his fists. "That's it. That's the break we need." But Lawson hesitated. "There's more," he said, "and you're not going to like it." Daniel's stomach twisted. "Tell me." Lawson leaned forward. His voice dropped to a whisper. "The victim, Carter Reynolds, hired Elliot Grayson before his murder. We thought it was security work, but it wasn't." He hesitated. It was blackmail. Daniel's blood ran cold. Lawson continued. "Reynolds had dirt on Grayson. Financial fraud, connections to organized crime, serious charges. We believe Reynolds threatened to expose him unless he paid up." Daniel exhaled sharply. "So Grayson killed him and framed you for it." A deep silence filled the room. Daniel stared at the table, his mind reeling. For months, he had been trapped in this nightmare, painted as a monster betrayed by the system. But now the truth had emerged, and the only reason it had come to light was Max, his dog, his best friend, his guardian. If Max hadn't reacted that day in the courtroom, Daniel would be rotting in a prison cell for the rest of his life. Instead, he now had a shot at freedom, but they had to move fast. The next day, Daniel sat in a holding cell, waiting. He had agreed to something risky, something that could either bring him justice or send him even deeper into the abyss. A trap. Lawson had arranged a private meeting between Elliot Grayson and an investigator posing as an interested party, a lawyer willing to help him cover his tracks. The meeting was being recorded. And Daniel? Daniel had been given permission to listen in. He sat in the small room, a headset over his ears, heart pounding in anticipation as the conversation began. At first, Grayson was calm, confident. He denied everything. But then the investigator pushed. "Why did Max recognize you?" A beat of silence. Then Grayson scoffed. "Dogs don't recognize people like that." Daniel gritted his teeth. "Yes, they do." The investigator continued. "Funny, because Max sure seemed to remember you." Grayson laughed nervously. "It's just a dog." The jury didn't convict that mutt. They convicted Daniel. "But the dog was at the crime scene," the investigator pressed. "And he identified you, not Daniel." Silence. A tense, suffocating silence. Then, Grayson let out a quiet chuckle. "So what if he did?" His voice was low, dripping with arrogance. "What's a dog going to do? Testify in court." Daniel's blood boiled. Then, Grayson made his mistake. "Daniel was an easy target," he muttered. "No one was going to believe him. Not with my testimony. And certainly not over some stupid dog." There it was. The confession. Daniel sucked in a sharp breath as the investigator gave the prearranged signal. Within seconds, the door to the meeting room burst open. Officers stormed in. Elliot Grayson's stunned voice crackled through Daniel's headset. "Wait, what? What the hell is this?" "You're under arrest for perjury and conspiracy to commit murder," an officer said. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut was the most satisfying thing Daniel had ever heard. Grayson sputtered, panic setting in. "This is insane. You can't arrest me over dogs. We have your confession on tape." Silence. Then Grayson snapped. He thrashed, screaming as officers restrained him. "I'm not going to prison." He was supposed to take the fall. "You hear me?" Daniel closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. It was over. Days later, Daniel stood in front of the same judge who had sentenced him to life in prison. Only this time, he wasn't wearing shackles. The courtroom was packed, tension thick in the air. The judge looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Daniel Reeves, in light of the new evidence and the perjury committed by the prosecution's key witness, your conviction is overturned." The words struck him like lightning. Gasps filled the room. Emily let out a choked sob. His lawyer smiled. Daniel barely heard any of it. He was free. Finally free. The moment he stepped outside the courthouse, the first thing he saw was Max. His loyal German shepherd stood with Emily, ears perked, tail wagging furiously. The second Max saw him, he bolted forward. Daniel dropped to his knees, just in time for Max to slam into him, licking his face with frantic energy. He laughed, burying his hands into Max's thick fur. "You saved me, buddy," he murmured. Max let out a happy bark, as if to say, "Of course I did." Tears burned at the edges of Daniel's eyes. For months, he had felt hopeless, trapped, forgotten. But through it all, Max had never given up on him. And now, because of him, because of his loyalty, his intelligence, his unwavering love, Daniel had his life back. He hugged his dog tightly, whispering words only Max could hear. "Let's go home." The drive home felt surreal. Daniel stared out the window, watching the world pass by as if he were seeing it for the first time. It had been over a year since he'd felt free, since he'd breathed fresh air without shackles weighing him down. And the only reason he was here, sitting in the passenger seat, heading home, was the dog curled up beside him. Max. The German shepherd lay with his head on Daniel's lap, his warm breath steady, his body finally relaxed after months of tension. He had known Daniel was innocent. He had fought for him when no one else had. And now they were together again. Emily glanced over from the driver's seat, a smile tugging at her lips. "He hasn't left your side once." Daniel chuckled, scratching behind Max's ears. Not that he ever did before. Max let out a small huff, shifting to get even closer, as if making sure Daniel was really there. It was funny, Daniel thought. He had always known Max was special, loyal, smart. But this went beyond what any trainer, any expert could explain. Max had saved his life, and Daniel wasn't sure he would ever be able to repay him. When they finally pulled up to the house, Daniel hesitated before stepping out. For so long, he had dreamed about coming home. But after everything that had happened, would it still feel like home? Max, however, had no hesitation. The moment the door opened, he jumped out and sprinted to the front door, his tail wagging wildly. Daniel smiled softly. If Max still saw this as home, maybe he could too. He stepped inside, inhaling deeply. The familiar scent of wood and coffee lingered in the air. The furniture was the same. His favorite chair still sat by the window. But something had changed. He had changed. The weight of his wrongful conviction had left scars, deep ones. He had spent months believing his life was over, that the world had turned its back on him. And yet, through it all, Max had never given up. Not once. Emily nudged his shoulder. "You okay?" Daniel nodded, exhaling. "Yeah, just taking it in." She gave him a knowing smile. "You'll get there." Max trotted over and nuzzled Daniel's hand, his warm brown eyes filled with understanding. Daniel kneeled, pressing his forehead to Max's. "We made it, buddy." Max licked his cheek, tail wagging. It was his way of saying, "I never doubted it." In the following weeks, Daniel's story spread. News outlets covered his exoneration, calling it a miracle of justice. But what truly captured people's hearts was Max, the German shepherd who had known the truth before anyone else did. People called him a hero. Some even suggested he be given an honorary medal. But to Daniel, Max wasn't just a hero. He was family. One evening, Daniel sat on the porch, Max lying beside him, staring out at the setting sun. The warmth of freedom settled in his chest, but so did something else, gratitude. Gratitude for the second chance he had been given, for the love of a dog who had never stopped believing in him, for the bond that had saved his life. He reached down, scratching Max's ears. "You know, buddy, I think we have work to do." Max perked up, tilting his head. Daniel smiled. "There are people out there just like me. Innocent. Forgotten. Maybe we can help them." Max let out a happy bark, as if saying, "I'm in." And in that moment, Daniel knew his story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because sometimes the most powerful proof of innocence isn't found in evidence or testimony. Sometimes it's found in the unwavering loyalty of a dog who never stops believing in the truth.